Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and as you can see, there are two guests today. And what we're actually going to do is I'm going to debate Professor Walter Block on minarchism versus anarchism, and we are very fortunate to have moderating the debate the great podcaster Tom Woods. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tom Woods.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I am going to be very laissez-faire as a moderator here because nobody really wants to hear from me here. We want to hear these two debaters talking to each other. So I am here, first of all, to introduce them both, then to turn it over to them for opening statements, and then really just let them talk. And as long as, nobody's being interrupted and anything like that, I'm just going to be sitting in the background, kind of more or less babysitting, but it's the wrong word, but just letting them have this conversation for about an hour or so. Now, if you are watching this broadcast, you probably already know Mike Liebowitz, but I feel like this episode is likely to go beyond the usual audience that he might have. So I want to say that Mike is an objectivist, a podcaster, and the author of two books, including View from a Cage, My Transformation from Convict to Crusader for Liberty. And then we have Walter Block, who's a professor of economics at Loyola University in New Orleans, who is the author of numerous books, including the notorious book Defending the Undefendable. So before recording, we decided that Mike would go first. So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you both for doing this. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. It's an absolute honor. So I think that Walter and I would probably agree that the whole purpose and why we're interested in this topic is because we want to see individual rights protected. Now, he believes that the best way to do this would be an anarcho-capitalist society wherein you have competing defense agencies trying to get customers, and the customers are seeking out the best agencies to protect their rights. I, on the other hand, think the best way to do this would be through what you have called minarchy, but I would say would be a state that's limited by a written constitution and is there to protect rights. Now, I'm not optimistic that any such state is likely to occur in the near future or even ever. After all, it's never occurred in the past. It's been tried and it's failed. But human beings have free will. And given that's the case, any human institutions that are involved, past is not necessarily prologue. So my hope is that enough people will be convinced in the liberty philosophy and will adopt such a society. I mean, after all societies are ultimately driven either by a majority or a very strong, opinionated minority. Now, there's also never been an anarcho-capitalist society. There's been anarchic societies, certainly, but never an anarcho-capitalist society. So this discussion will be largely hypothetical. That doesn't mean that it isn't productive, and I really think that it will be. So with that, I'll turn it over and let Walter give his opening talk, and we'll get into the minutia as the debate goes on.
All right, Walter.
Okay. The way Mike sketches it is which would work better. And that's a pragmatic or utilitarian issue. And I think that's an important one. And I will address myself to that as well. But I also am a big fan of deontology. What's right? And my implicit premise is that whatever is right will also be pragmatic or utilitarian or lead to human prosperity. So every government taxes. Now, Ayn Rand says that the taxes should be voluntary, but if it's voluntary, it's not a government. To me, a government necessarily requires taxes, and taxes are compulsory. And compulsory anything, whenever anyone threatens somebody else and says, give me money or I'll do bad things to you, I'll use violence against you, they're criminals. Well, government is per se a criminal organization. because they compel you to pay taxes whether you like it or not, and you haven't agreed to pay taxes. And the first letter from the IRS will not be a nasty letter. They'll say something, hey, did you forget? We really need the money. But after the second letter is, we really need the money. And the third letter is, if you don't give us the money, we're going to kick your butt. And then some guy in a blue uniform with a badge and a gun is going to say, come with me. And if you don't come with him, he's going to shoot you. So the government is a criminal enterprise. And I find it difficult to see how a criminality can lead to prosperity and to good effects. So that's the first leg of the anarcho-capitalist case against government. The second one is, Mike and I might get into a fight. And, I hit him, he hits me. And Tom, the government, has got to stop us because, fighting is uncivilized. And I'm appointing Tom. By the way, I disagree with Tom when he said that nobody wants to hear from him. He's one of the leading theoreticians of libertarianism. And so he was wrong on that one. So I'm sorry, Tom, I have to criticize you.
No buttering up the moderator, Walter.
Okay. The point I'm trying to make here is that the logic of government leads to world government. Because what is the relationship of Canada and Burundi? It's one of anarchism. There's no government above them. So if Canada and Burundi get into a fight, who's supposed to stop them? If you adhere to the logic of the U.S. government, where I'm appointing Tom the U.S. government, so he can't accuse me of buttering him up. Because the U.S. government is not good, and now Tom is the U.S. government. So there's a parallel or an analogy or a similarity here. Namely, one of the arguments for the U.S. government is to make sure everybody obeys the law and doesn't initiate violence against each other. And here, Mike and I are having a big fight, and Tom, the U.S. government, has to stop us. Well, by that same logic, the world government has got to make sure that Canada and Burundi behave themselves. So if Mike wants to adhere to minarchism, and he wants to be logical, dare I say, and he wants to allow himself to be led to the logical conclusion of a U.S. government, he's got to favor world government. Well, world government is a problem, especially for Jews. They don't like us in this European country, we go there. They don't like us here, we go there. If there's a world government, there's no place to go. And Mars is not receptive yet. And if there's a world government and it's at all democratic, it's going to be run mainly by India and China, because those two countries together have most of the, well, I don't think most of the world's population, but a goodly part of it. And as Mike correctly says, a strong minority, and let alone a majority, can run things. Do we really want to be run by the Chinese and the Indians? I don't think so. Okay, the third thing is secession. Now, libertarianism is predicated on two principles. The non-aggression principle, nobody should initiate or threaten invasion against anyone else. And property rights are based on homesteading and voluntary trade. But we have a third principle, if you will, and that's free association. Nobody should be compelled to associate with anyone else against his will. I mean, the problem with rape is that the victim doesn't want to associate with the rapist. The problem with slavery is that the slave doesn't want to associate with the slave master, and yet they're compelled to do so. So I hope that Randians and objectivists and libertarians can unite on the grounds that we shouldn't have any compelled association. Anyone should be free to disassociate from anyone else. Well, this leads to secession. So I live in New Orleans, and suppose Louisiana wants to secede from the U.S., and a majority of Louisianians agree. And by the way, this is a made-up example, but there are cases like in Spain. There's a group that wants to secede, and what is it in Canada? Quebec is always thinking of seceding from Canada. Okay, so Louisiana wants to secede from the U.S. And now New Orleans wants to secede from Louisiana. Those rotten kids in Baton Rouge, we don't want to have anything to do with them. So Louisiana wants to secede. And now I live in Uptown, and the Uptown neighborhood wants to secede from New Orleans. And my square block wants to secede from Uptown. And now I want to secede from my square block. Everybody has a right to secede. Well, if everyone has a right to secede, well, then we're all sovereign. It's going to sound a little difficult, but one of the implications of this for the anarcho-capitalist position is that we favor government, 8 billion of them. Each one of us should have a government. So if you want to ask a girl out for a date, you just can't ask a girl out for a date. You have to go to your foreign minister and ask your foreign minister to get together with her foreign minister, and then you can get it. I'm kidding about that foreign minister stuff. But the point is that we would have if we allow secession down to the individual level, we have 8 billion countries or 8 billion sovereign individuals. And now there are always going to be bad guys, and hopefully it'll be 1 or 2% of bad guys. And now we get defense agencies that will try to, try to make things good. Right now, the trouble with the government cops is half of what they do is okay. They stop murder, they stop rape, or at least they arrest people for doing bad things like that. But they also stop victimless crimes. Whereas, by the way, there are more private police than public police, government police in the U.S. They help out at shopping malls, and all they do is try to stop theft and murder and rape and stuff on the mall, because in the shopping mall, it's bad business to allow that stuff. But they don't stop victimless crimes like pornography or prostitution or gambling or drugs or whatever like that. The next point I want to make is, how do you start up a government? And let's take 1776, when the U.S. government was started, and somebody from the U.S. Goes out to the boonies of Ohio or Western Pennsylvania and says, hey, we're starting up the U.S. government. And this guy says, oh, that's great. We'll trade, we'll be friends. And he says, you don't understand. You're part of it. He says, what, me? I'm not a joiner. I don't want to join the government. And the guy says, well, you have to. And he says, you have to? Well, that violates the law of free association. I don't want to associate with you like that. I'm willing to trade with you, but I don't want to be part of your organization. And the guy says, well, too bad, you are. Well, what kind of a philosophy is that? And then there's the amount of deaths, and this is sort of unfair to blame on Mike, but all's fair in love and war, so I'll blame Mike for this, even though he doesn't support it. How many deaths have been created by governments? According to the latest figures or the historical figures, it's not in the millions, it's in the billions of people that have been killed by governments. Now, okay, it's a little unfair because Mike doesn't favor that kind of government that kills millions of people, like Stalin or Mao or Hitler or anything like that. But if you're defending government, you have to defend government, and these governments are not that good. Okay, one last one. How would anarchy work? Well, it would work like the grocery store or the shopping mall or any private company. You want to go get a shirt or a pair of shoes or a burger, you go to McDonald's. Well, now McDonald's might have police and courts. And this way, we would have a market process. I mean, we all agree, well, I don't know if we all agree, but most economists agree that the best way to get a good situation going is with competition. But government is a monopoly. I mean, government doesn't tolerate any other group in its geographical area. But if we believe that competition brings about a better price and a lower price and higher quality, well, these defense agencies would be no exception to that rule. So I conclude by saying that the case in favor of government is highly problematic, and the case in favor of anarcho-capitalism is justified.
All right, so now the discussion will ensue. So I guess, Mike, why don't you confront Walter here?
Okay. Well, I'm happy to learn that I'm an anarchist because Walter has defined me into being one. Note at the beginning that he said if you don't have compulsory taxation, you don't have a government. But there's nothing inherent in the concept or definition of government that mandates compulsory taxation. So the definition of government that I'm using is an agency that has a monopoly over retaliatory force in a given geographic location. Again, nothing about that mandates taxation. So Walter said that he's also a deontologist. I'm not. I'm also not a utilitarian. So a deontologist believes that what is right regardless of consequences, right? But we agreed at the beginning that the entire purpose is to protect individual rights. So if you have a situation where individual rights are not protected, then doing the right thing, which you would have to as a deontologist, would negate the entire purpose of the reason that you have rights to begin with. The next thing that Walter said was that nations are in a state of anarchy with each other. And I hear this a lot. The problem is that each nation governs a geographic area, and each nation has laws that if you're in that location, you have to go by those laws. And most of those I would disagree with. So that's not exactly the case with anarcho-capitalism, where you would have nobody governing a geographic location. You could have 1,000 people dispersed across a geographical location, each with their own agency. Walter also brought up secession, which I find interesting because Yodi said if a majority of the people, say in Louisiana, want to secede, okay, a majority wants to secede. What about the minority who doesn't want to? They're in the geographic locality. You now have the majority forcing them to secede, and you violate the very principle that you're going by. The idea that I'm defending, if you defend one type of government, you're defending all of them, is obviously nonsensical. I defend a constitutional government that protects individual rights. That's not the same thing as defending Maoist China, Stalin Russia, or the French Republic under Robespierre, or the empire under Napoleon. These are vastly different things, although they're all government. Now, Walter said that there's already all types of private defense in the United States. But then he said that governments don't tolerate private groups within the country. Well, that's clearly a contradiction. You've already said that there are such groups, and now saying that they're not allowed, which they are. Obviously, people should be free to associate with whomever they want. And I have to confess, after reading Lysander Spooner's No Treason, the Constitution, No Authority, I was befuddled. I said, well, I don't think that this system is workable, but at the same time, you have to violate rights in order to make my system work, so I'm caught in a contradiction. Then I read Randy Barnett's Restoring the Lost Constitution, and in it, he makes the case, and I think effectively, that consent is not necessary to be under a government's jurisdiction so long as that government is not initiating force against you. So if a government is not taxing you, it can still have you under its jurisdiction, meaning all it's doing is protecting the citizens under its jurisdiction and retaliating against force. In the same way, Tom, if you punch me in the face, I don't need your consent to retaliate. And it's the same thing. If you have a government over a given geographic location, as long as that government is not violating rights, it's okay. Now, Walter said, how do we start governments? Now, this brings us to a very important point. Are we starting at a hypothetical state of nature, or are we starting where we are now? If we're starting in a hypothetical state of nature, I agree 1,000%. You're going to have competition, and there's no way to stop it. as to who's going to rule or what government is going to take place. And if you're starting now, you have to say, well, how are we going to get to the point where we're defending rights? My hypothetical is if you have a government over a geographic location that all it's doing is protecting rights, you are free to have your own protection agency. However, if my government is in place and most people in the geographic locality have delegated their right to retaliatory force to it. Now, if Tom and I get into a disagreement, my government has to have jurisdiction. Now, people might say, well, that's still a rights violation. But if nobody has jurisdiction, then Tom's agency defends him, mine defends me. There's no final arbiter. We just, Tom and I can just continually not agree to a resolution. You need to have a final arbiter. So with that, I'm sure Walter has a nimity of objections to what I've said. So I'll turn it back over to him.
Okay, Mike, you'll remember that with regard to Stalin and Mao and Hitler, I wasn't really serious in taxing you with them. I was sort of half kidding on that. I know you don't favor that, and you abhor that as much as I do. Yes, I sort of contradicted myself a little bit, but what's a contradiction between friends? I'm kidding about that too. Yes, the government allows private defense agencies. There are detective agencies. There are Brinks guards and people like that. The point is that they're all under the supervision of government. And if there's a conflict between any of these private companies and government thinks it will prevail or has the power to prevail. Because really, the definition of government is two things. One, I mentioned taxes. The other is that they demand a monopoly of ultimate force, not of force, because the Second Amendment allows people to have guns and we all have fists. So we all have force. But the government, if it is contrary or different from a private detective agency, the government will prevail. Now, in a sense, we sort of have to agree to disagree, because if you look, I say that the definition of government is two things. One, a monopoly, they demand a monopoly of force in a given geographical area, and two, they tax. And if you deny that, I don't think you're denying so much the monopoly of force in a given geographical area, but you're denying that they tax. Well, I find that highly problematic. I mean, if a government doesn't tax, in what way are they different than a private defense agency? Well, apart from demanding a monopoly, and demanding a monopoly is also a problem. But the key is no government ever has not taxed. I mean, how else do they finance themselves? Now, Ayn Rand says, well, they finance themselves by a lottery or voluntary payments or something like that. But that's a private defense agency. And if the Washington, D.C. Private defense agency can have a lottery, well, so can the Jones or the Tom Woods or the Mike or the Walter Defense Agency as well. Now, with regard to only a majority of people want to secede from the U.S. in Louisiana. Well, what happens to the minority? Well, the minority can secede from Louisiana. So look, suppose that New Orleans wants to secede and they have a unanimity. Everyone in New Orleans wants to secede, but the people in Baton Rouge, they don't want to secede. So Louisiana secedes, and then Baton Rouge sets up its own little company or government, or it goes back into the U.S. So there's no contradiction there with the minority rights. Now, Mike is fond of saying that the whole point is to uphold rights. Well, how do you uphold rights when you demand a monopoly? That means that you can only go to one functionary, one provider of defense services, and also that there are taxes. So I don't see how you can defend rights by starting off by violating rights. And the government violates rights by demanding a monopoly of power in a given geographical area and by taxing. And if you say that they're not taxing, you're sort of giving up your position and you're taking the ANCAP position, because that's what ANCAP wants: no taxes. And taxes and government are, I wouldn't say synonyms, but they're very well connected. Now, Mike also mentions a distinction between starting a government de novo in a state of nature, and also, right now, what are we going to do with setting up a better government? I was thinking of a state of nature. I was thinking of 1776, when there was no government period and we were sort of in a state of nature. And this guy in Ohio or Western Pennsylvania didn't really want to join, and he was compelled to join. And that's not protecting rights, to compel people to join a government. I mean, if people don't want to join a government and you compel them to join a government, you're not protecting their rights. You're violating their rights. Okay, so that would be the state of nature. Well, how about right now? Well, we have a government and it violates rights. We're going to have one of two presidential candidates, Harris or Trump, and neither of them is a libertarian, although Trump has promised to put a libertarian in the cabinet. And also, he's promised to give a pardon to a libertarian who's been in jail for 10 years on drug things. So I favor him. But look, if Ron Paul were president, and Ron Paul is a lot closer to, I think, what Mike and I and Tom both want. If he were the president, or take, what's his name from Argentina, Milei, who is also pretty good, pretty damn good, I would say. What they would do is start to whittle down government, and I certainly favor less government, or less less intrusive government. I favor a less intrusive government to a more intrusive government, and I'm sure Mike would agree with me on that. But the key is, suppose we want to secede from this government. I mean, we had a war about this in 1861. By the way, that was not a civil war. A civil war is two groups, each want to run the whole country. Spain in 1936 was a civil war. The commies and the fascists each wanted to run Spain. In 1917, Russia was a civil war, because the red and the white armies each wanted to run the whole kit and caboodle. Whereas I learned from my friend Tom DiLorenzo, the South just wanted to secede. It was not a civil war. The South didn't want to run the North. The North wanted to run both the North and the South. So Louisiana wants to secede. Will Mike support this? And now Louisiana wants to secede. Will Mike support this? And I think the key element is where we're really, I don't know how to address this. When Mike says that governments don't tax or need not tax, I say, well, then they're not governments. And he says they are governments. And I don't know how to reconcile that, except to say we'll have to agree to disagree.
Okay, so in my opening statement, I stated the things that I thought we would agree with each other. And I did that for a reason, right? Because if human beings have free will, then any human institution can change. Past is not necessarily prologue. So while it's true that every government in the past had taxed, that's not an intrinsic part of government. The only way to establish the type of society I want, or the type of society you want, is to convince enough people. So if enough people are convinced that we can have a government that doesn't tax, then we can do it. And it would still be a government because, as you stated, they will have a monopoly on one thing: retaliatory force. They will have jurisdiction to decide disputes on its territory. And here's why it's necessary. I'll give you three examples. I can give more later on, but I want to stick to three right now. Rights are not intrinsic. Rights are discovered in a relationship between human beings. So there's going to be disagreements even amongst those of us who want to defend individual rights. So For instance, I recently had a debate with Stephan Kinsella about intellectual property. He thinks intellectual property is a rights violation. I think intellectual property is a necessity. So in an ANCAP society where you have a geographic area, say it covers Connecticut, where I live, right? Now you've got all different viewpoints in this society, and each person goes to a defense agency that's going to represent his point of view. I write a song. This song is absolutely wonderful, and I am a proponent of intellectual property. Walter, you steal my song and sell it to Tom, and neither one of you believes in intellectual property. I immediately go to my defense agency and I say, look, these guys have ripped me off. I want to sue them. Go get them. Your defense agencies say, no, our guys have done nothing wrong at all. How do we resolve it? Then take an instance, say you have an 18-year-old kid and he has sex with a 17-year-old girl. His defense agency says it's legal. Her parents' defense agency says it's not. Her parents call their defense agency to go apprehend the kid. They go. His defense agency protects him. What do you do? How about a situation where a man impregnates a woman? She belongs to a defense agency, upholds the right to abortion. His defense agency says it's against the law. You can't do this. She wants to have an abortion. He says, no way, my child. He sends his defense agency in to intervene. Her defense agency protects her. There's no final arbiter. How do you resolve it?
Excellent challenges, and I thank you for them. Very well put. By the way, I'm a fan of Stephan Kinsella, not on voluntary slavery, where I just had a debate with him, but on IP. I think he's right. And you make three very good points about young age sex, statutory rape, in effect, and abortion, and intellectual property. Look, suppose that instead of this occurring, well, let me start again. You now concede to me, and I emphasize that word, that no, government will not tax, but we've discussed that, but the government has to have a monopoly. Well, look, I noticed that you have a nice headphone. And suppose I said, you can't buy a headphone from that guy that you bought the headphone from. I have a monopoly of headphones. You got to buy them from me. And I'm going to come at you with a gun and I say, throw away that headphone and stomp on it. And if you want another headphone, you got to come to me. A monopoly is a violation of rights. And a monopoly of headphones, or a monopoly of shirts, or a monopoly of cars, or a monopoly of computers, or a monopoly of flowers is a violation of rights. And so is a monopoly of defense services. So I think that there's a problem on your side when you admit that government needs a monopoly. Now let me address the problems that you're talking about, where there's a fight between two I wouldn't say reasonable, but at least unresolved issues. Abortion is an unresolved issue. Half of our country favors pro-life, half favors pro-choice. And whether a 17-year-old, what's the statutory rape age? You can't deduce any age from libertarian principles. So these are very good points that you've raised. My response is two. First of all, suppose that it's not two Americans, but that it's a Canadian boy and he's 18, and the American girl who's 17. And now the American girl parents who are 17 say, I want that Canadian boy arrested because in this country, the statutory rape age is 18 and my daughter is only 17. And I want you to come get that boy and put him in jail for statutory rape. Well, how is the US and Canada going to deal with this? Well, one way is a world government. And this, I think, is a weakness on your part because the only monopolistic way, and you're a monopolist, if I can call you that, the only monopolistic way is to have a world government. And do we really want to have a world government? So that would be one answer, and it would be the same for statutory rape or IP or abortion or any different difference of opinion between the Canadian and the American, or between the American and the Mexican, or between the Canadian and the Burundian. It doesn't have to be a contiguous place. You have to deal with the problem of world government. Secondly, suppose two private defense agencies disagree, and they're both private defense agencies in the U.S. Now, what Robert Nozick says, and Robert Nozick is on your side, what he says is, look, there's going to be a primary defense agency, and then there are going to be subsidiary ones, and the primary one is better, and that'll become the government. And since it's going to take away the right of the subsidiary defense agencies, it has to give them something in return, namely it has to protect them. I go more with Murray Rothbard on that one rather than Robert Nozick. So what are the specifics? The specifics are that there'll be two types of defense agencies. One I'll call a bandit defense agency, and their motto is my way or the highway. And whenever they get into an altercation with another defense agency, whether it's on IP or abortion or statutory rape ages, what they're going to say is, we'll fight. The other kind of agency is a rational defense agency, a reasonable defense agency, and they say, look, if we come to a disagreement with your defense agency and we'll have a contract, we will go to the Tom Woods court, and whatever he says, we'll abide by. And what Tom Woods would probably do on these intractable issues, where I don't think abortion is intractable. I think the only proper answer is neither pro-life nor pro-choice, but evictionism. But take IPs, and suppose we can't resolve it. What Tom is going to do, I think, he's going to flip a coin, and there'll be no fighting, because Mike, you have a defense agency that believes in IP rights. I have a defense agency that doesn't. I'm with Kinsella on this one. And we now have a dispute. And given that you're not a bandit defense agency, but you're a libertarian defense agency, and you and I have a contract that if ever you and I come up with an issue where we're irreconcilable, we're going to Tom, and Tom will decide. And if Tom can't decide on the IP, let's say he can't decide, and it's a very important issue, I think he's going to flip a coin, and both of us will adhere to that coin flip, because we don't want to fight unless it's necessary. Now, a little bit of economics in here. The bandit defense agencies is going to have to fight with every other defense agency, other bandits and legitimate defense agencies. Whereas legitimate defense agencies are only going to have to fight with bandit ones, because you and I, Mike, are legitimate defense agencies, and I've just told you how we're going to solve this intractable debate. Tom will flip a coin, or Tom will do something like that, and we won't fight. Well, a little economics says that defense agencies will be unstable. They will lose out in the market share, because they're going to have to fight everyone. And you and I, Mike, are not going to have to fight everyone. We're only going to have to fight bandits, and the bandits will disappear. And that's how the anarcho-capitalist system will work.
Okay, so in the first example you gave, you said if somebody from the United States has sex with someone from Canada, but here's the difference. There's clear jurisdictional boundaries. So wherever they had sex, the law of that jurisdiction governs. When there's anarcho-capitalism, you have no such thing. Jurisdiction follows the person, and his defense agency defends him. So to argue my point doesn't lead to one world. The idea that if my liberty is on the line, I'm going to turn that over to a coin flip, no chance in hell. And I don't think anybody else, not a reasonable person, would. Like you said, competition leads to good products. The defense agency is really going to want to defend its customers. And to say in cases where you disagree about issues of law and legality, they're going to have a coin flip, I don't see it. In a monopoly, it's important to distinguish, as Mises does, between a monopoly on product in a monopoly on price. And it's the monopoly on price that matters. And given that the government I'm talking about, it's voluntary, if that government is not protecting the rights of its citizens, then I would agree you can form whatever type of agency you want because your rights are not being defended. Now, you mentioned Nozick, and that's interesting because what Nozick ultimately is saying is that in an anarcho system, there's no equilibrium. Now, the empirical work of Vincent Geloso, when it comes to anarchic societies, he says there's no stable equilibrium because even when they're successful, they're inviting outside invaders that are going to come take over it. That's empirical work. But I think the logic of it shows it as well. If you had a thriving anarchic system in a geographic location, say the United States, but they're not united, you're inviting other countries, other nations to come in, and you don't have the proper defense. But there's another thing as well, is that in an anarchic system, there's no guarantee, as David Friedman says, it's going to be a libertarian society. And Arnold Kling, relying on the work of Scott Wiener, says, in fact, you don't have libertarian societies. They refer to the much vaunted Iceland and say this was not a libertarian society. In fact, it was a violent society. There was an order, yes, but it wasn't a libertarian order by any stretch of the imagination. And one last question I have is this. Suppose you have a defense agency, you get a bunch of pedophiles who want to start a defense agency that's going to protect their right to be pedophiles. And the only people that belong to this organization are pedophiles, and they just deal with each other when it comes to trade, whatever. How do you stop that? What are you going to do? You just going to say, well, we're non-interventionists, so it's okay? Now, if you have such a thing when a government is in charge of geographic location, you can step right in. So with those, oh wait, let me just throw up one more example to you, Walter. If it's too much, just let me know and I'll repeat it. But suppose I'm where I am right now, and I look out my window and I see an assault taking place across the street. Right now, if I see that taking place, I dial 911. That's routed right to my local police department. They send the people, the cops. They have jurisdiction. They handle it. Now, in an anarcho-capitalist society, I look out the window. I see this taking place. Whom do I call? Not only that, but I have neighbors. Whom do they call? Suppose I call my agency. My neighbor call their agency. Another neighbor calls his agency. The victim calls his agency. And just to sort of tell things in his favor, the assailant, the guy that's actually committing the assault, calls says he's under attack. Now you have all these agencies show up. Who is jurisdiction? And with that, Walter, I turn it back over to you.
Okay. Again, I congratulate you on very good points, very well thought out points. With regard to the pedophile, we were already discussing the pedophile thing with the 18-year-old and the 17-year-old. And in effect, the 18-year-old is a pedophile because he's dealing with an underage girl. Now, you see, when I talk about a coin flip, I'm talking about intractable issues. Look, we know that, just because we can't figure out whether it's 18 or 17 is the proper statutory rape age doesn't mean we can't make any distinctions. We know, all of us know that if you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, even if she agrees, you're a statutory rapist because we don't think 5-year-old girls can agree any such thing. On the other hand, if you go to bed with a 25-year-old woman and she agrees, whatever you are, you're not a pedophile. But so we're clear on that. I mean, all reasonable, rational people would agree with what I just said. But is the cutoff point 16, 17, 18, 19, 15? These are intractable issues that can't be deduced from libertarian principles. You have to come up with some arbitrary number. 18 seems reasonable to me, but somebody might say 17, and I'm not going to say, what, you're a maniac, 17? That's ridiculous. I'm not going to say that. Now, to get to your point about the boy and the girl, suppose they have sex right on the border. there's a border between the U.S. and Canada. I don't know how big it is, but there's a border, and one of them is on this side of the border, and the other is on that side, and then they switch sides, and so that won't work. And also, the IP doesn't work with borders because, I stole your song. Remember that? That's not a border issue. See, I'm talking about coin flips only when there's an intractable issue, and you're making it as every issue is going to be done that way. Now, the second thing that you say is the U.S. will be vulnerable to its enemies if we have different defense agencies. Well, the defense agencies can have a contract. They can say, look, if the Ruskies or the Martians or whoever it is attacks, we unite. In 1947, the defense agencies of the Jews in Palestine, the Irgun, the Stern, the Lehigh, the Palmach, were able to knock out 5 governmental armies, militaries. So there's no reason that the defense agencies can't unite when there's a common foreign enemy. Then the question about, you see an assault on the street. Well, who owns that street? I have a book saying, well, I have I think Tom mentioned my series of Defending the Undefendable. I have Defending the Undefendable 1, 2, 3. I also have a series on privatization, 4 books. One, why we should privatize everything. My motto there is, if it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. Since everything either moves or doesn't move, you privatize everything. Well, that's the one book. The second book is why we should privatize the highways. The third is why we should privatize oceans, rivers, and lakes. And the fourth one is why we should privatize the moon and space race and stuff like that. So to answer your question, you live in a house and you're on the 6th floor and you look down on the street and there's an assault. Well, you call the owner of that road or of that street because each street will be privately owned and will have a private defense agency. Now, forget about taxes. We've disagreed, or we've agreed to disagree. You say that government need not tax. I say it must, and I don't know how to get over that one. But on this other one, you're very vulnerable. You say that the government should have a monopoly. Monopoly is evil. Monopoly means that I can't go to someone else. Now, you said that I contradicted myself, that, the government allows private defense agencies, private detective agencies. Sure, it does. But they're always under the government's supervision. They have to get a government license to be a Brinks guard or whatever it is. But if it's a monopoly is pure evil. A monopoly says it violates free association. A monopoly, again, with the headphones. You bought those headphones, you dirty rat, from somebody else, and I have a monopoly over headphones? How dare you? Well, why should headphones be any different than defense agencies? So there, I think you're very vulnerable. Your position is very vulnerable on taxes and monopoly. Taxes, I don't know what to say, because you just deny what I regard as a primordial truth. But on monopoly, you're sitting there and saying that you're defending monopoly. And this is against every element of libertarianism that I can think of.
Okay, so first, in regard to the owner of the road, first of all, I may not know who owns a given road. Secondly, what if the owner of the road is the assailant? What if somebody attacks somebody in the attacker's home? If somebody comes in my house and I beat him up, you're going to call my defense agency? That doesn't seem reasonable to me. And as far as this idea of inherent evil, well, I don't know why it's inherently evil. And I don't know how it in most cases violates free association. You can have an agency, you can join up with your pals. The one thing you can't do is have ultimate jurisdiction in the geographic area. That's the only point at which we disagree. And if the entire point is to protect rights, it seems that you're going to cut off your nose to spite your face. You're going to say, well, consequences be damned. we're going to hold to this point of morality when, like I said, the logic that Nozick used, I believe, was compelling to show that ultimately one agency would end up. Scott Wiener's work shows that anarchic systems are not libertarian societies, and Vincent Gelosso's empirical work shows that there's no stable equilibrium under anarchy. And if all that's true, I don't see how you have a system that defends rights. So you're ultimately going to throw rights out the window in order to uphold that principle, which I don't even concede is being violated. And with that, I'll end my talk for today. We agreed on an hour, and I want to cede Walter the last point. So before we wind up, I just want to once again thank both of you for being willing to do this. Walter, you've been the consummate gentleman, and you are a very thoughtful opponent. This has been an absolute honor to debate you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Since you went first, I'll just say a few words. This ultimate jurisdiction business is a world government, and I don't think you want a world government, and that's the only monopoly. I mean, if you favor monopoly, you should not only favor monopoly within a country, but the world is a jurisdiction, and we should have a world government, and I find that highly problematic. Let me just end by saying that I think you did an excellent job in upholding your position, and Tom, you did an excellent job of letting us dispute each other. And you know, it's interesting. Right now, a lot of people won't speak to me because of my views on Israel. And I find that very highly problematic because we libertarians disagree on so many things. We disagree on abortion, there's pro-life, pro-choice. We disagree on immigration. We disagree on government. And yet, nobody is kicking anyone out of the libertarian movement on any of these other issues, only Israel. And I don't understand why that. Well, I think I do understand, but I don't want to go into it now. But just let me say that this is what libertarianism should be like. We had a civil discussion. We didn't interrupt each other. We accredited the other guy for some points. We were polite to each other. We'll still be friends. That's what libertarianism should be all about. It shouldn't be that, you know, well, you disagree with me, the hell with you. You're not a libertarian. It's just crazy. And I'm glad that Tom shepherded us, even though he didn't need to. As it turned out, we would have been fine without him. His laissez-faire was excellent. So it was a pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this discussion.
Can I say something, though, at the end?
Sure.
Because this was such a civil conversation, and I was able to just observe it, this has to be the easiest job I have ever had. And as it turns out, also the lowest paid. So anyway, thank you guys for letting me be part of this.
Thank you, sir.
Take care, guys. Stay in touch.
All right. So long, everybody.
Bye.